At 7:32 a.m. on February 10, 1942, Lieutenant Commander John Thatch observed 6 Japanese Zeros diving toward his 4 Wildcats over Wake Island. Aware his pilots had perhaps only 90 seconds before they might perish, he was 37, with 214 flight hours in Wildcats and no victories against Zeros. The Japanese had sent 18 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters to sweep American patrols from the morning sky. Thatch's Wildcat was slower. The Zero climbed quicker, turned tighter, and could outmaneuver any American fighter at nearly every altitude. Japanese airmen knew it. American airmen knew it. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. A Zero could outturn a Wildcat in 14 seconds. 14 seconds to get on your tail. 14 seconds to line up guns. 14 seconds to kill you. By February, the Pacific Fleet had lost 43 Wildcats in one-on-one dogfights with Zeros, 43 pilots who tried to turn with Zeros, 43 funerals. The pattern never changed. An American pilot sighted a Zero. Engaged, the Zero outturned him. The Zero shot him down. Command kept issuing the same orders. Avoid turning fights. Disengage if possible. But running meant abandoning comrades and letting Zeros strafe your buddies while you fled. Thatch led Fighting Squadron 3. 4 pilots, 4 Wildcats, 4 men who trusted him to keep them alive. Yet he had no answer for the Zero's turn radius or climb rate. Only the helplessness of watching good men die. 3 days earlier, Thatch had sat in his quarters at Naval Air Station San Diego, staring at a pack of matches his wife had sent in a care package. 20 wooden matches in a thin cardboard box. He had been wrestling with the Zero problem for weeks. How do you beat an enemy who can outturn you? How do you survive when the foe is faster, more agile, and piloted by men with 2 years combat experience? Thatch picked up 2 matches, held them parallel, then moved them in opposite directions, weaving them past each other. The matches crossed and crossed again, never separating, always supporting one another. Something clicked. What if 2 Wildcats didn't fight independently? What if they flew as a pair, weaving back and forth? If a Zero got on one Wildcat's tail, that Wildcat would turn toward his wingman. The wingman would turn in return. They'd cross paths, and the Zero pursuing the first aircraft would fly straight into the second Wildcat's guns. It was audacious. It violated every fighter doctrine in the U.S. Navy manual. Fighters fought alone. Pairs stayed together for navigation, but split when combat began. That was how air combat had been taught since 1918. But Thatch couldn't stop picturing those matches weaving together or stop thinking about 43 dead pilots. He called in his wingman, Lieutenant Edward O'Hare, showed him the matches, and explained the weave. O'Hare studied them for 30 seconds, then asked one question: "When do we test it?" 4 days later, Thatch would find out if his matchstick weave would save lives or get 4 pilots killed. With the 6 Zeros 200 yards out and closing fast, Thatch keyed the radio. It was time to try something never attempted in combat. "Weave on my mark," he cracked over the air. His wingman, Lieutenant J.G. Edward Bassett, was 800 feet to his right. 2 more Wildcats, flown by Ensign Daniel Sheedy and Edgar Coulson, were about 1,000 feet beyond Bassett. 4 American fighters in a loose line faced 6 Zeros, diving from 11,000 feet. Standard doctrine said split up, turn independently, fight one-on-one. But Thatch issued a new order. "Bassett on me. Weave pattern. Execute!" Bassett banked toward Thatch. Thatch banked toward Bassett. They flew directly at one another. The Zeros dropped to 8,000 feet, perhaps thinking the Americans were panicking or about to collide. At 400 yards, both Wildcats banked hard. Thatch left, Bassett right, crossing with roughly 200 feet separation, then continuing the figure 8 weave. The lead Zero picked Bassett, close to 600 yards, expecting Bassett to try to outturn him. Instead, Bassett turned toward Thatch. The Zero followed, and as it lined up, Thatch came screaming through the opposite leg of the weave with guns blazing. The Zero pilot faced a choice: break off or fly into a wall of bullets. He broke off and climbed. The other 5 Zeros scattered. For the first time in the Pacific, Zeros were running from wildcats. Sheedy and Coulson saw the weave work and tried it themselves. When another Zero committed to Coulson's tail, Sheedy's weave forced the attacker to flinch and disengage. The dogfight lasted 6 minutes. 6 Zeros versus 4 wildcats. And when the Zeros finally climbed away, all 4 wildcats were still flying. Thatch checked fuel and wingmen. Nobody hit. Nobody killed. The weave had worked. He landed at Ford Island 40 minutes later, hands shaking not from fear, but from adrenaline, and the dawning realization that maybe American pilots didn't have to die every time they met Zeros. Fighter Command, however, remained skeptical. Thatch filed a combat report that afternoon describing the weave and recommending immediate adoption. 3 days later, the reply read, "Interesting tactic. Needs further testing. Not approved for widespread use." Thatch stared at that answer long and hard. 43 pilots dead that month, and Command wanted more tests. Meanwhile, the Japanese were planning bigger actions. In 68 days, Thatch would be over Midway facing 50 Zeros with 8 Wildcats. Between February and June 1942, Thatch drilled Fighting Squadron 3 on the weave every day. Morning flights, afternoon sorties, night formations. When the moon was bright enough, they practiced the pattern blind. Turn toward your wingman. Cross. Turn back. Cross again. Simple in theory, brutal in practice at 300 mph with Zeros shooting at you. The Navy had not officially approved the tactic, but Thatch didn't wait. He taught any pilot who would listen, showed the matches, sketched diagrams on blackboards, and explained the geometry. If a Zero commits to your tail, turn into your wingman. The Zero must choose. Follow and enter your wingman's guns or break off. Either way, you survive. Some pilots understood immediately. Others called Thatch crazy. One squadron commander complained the weave violated basic fighter doctrine. You can't fly toward another aircraft in combat. If you want to see if Cullen's beach trash cutters actually worked in combat, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because what happens next is insane. Back to Cullen. Bradley issued orders to the 52nd Ordnance Group that evening. Every available welder in Normandy would work 24-hour shifts, strict every German beach obstacle between the beachhead and Cherbourg. Install the cutting device on every Sherman, every light tank, every tank destroyer in First Army. Operation Cobra was scheduled for July 25th, 12 days away. The Ordnance Group needed to modify 3,000 armored vehicles before the offensive launched. That meant 250 tanks per day, 10 tanks per hour, 1 tank every 6 minutes. Cullen had 12 days to find out if his junkyard invention would break the stalemate or mean absolutely nothing when German anti-tank guns opened fire. Captain James Dye from the 52nd Ordnance Group arrived at the production site near Columbia on July 14th with 30 welders and 6 cutting torch rigs. He laid out the assembly process on a field table. Cut hedgehog beams into 450 sections. Grind edges to points. Weld to mounting plates. Bolt plates to tank bow. 4 hours per vehicle if everything worked perfectly. Nothing worked perfectly. The hedgehog steel was harder than standard construction grade. Cutting torches overheated after 20 minutes and needed cooling time. The first day's production yielded 8 completed devices. 8 tanks out of 3,000. At that rate, the Ordnance Group would finish modifications sometime in October. Operation Cobra would launch without them. Cullen spent July 15th troubleshooting the production line. The problem was heat buildup in the torch tips. The German steel absorbed thermal energy slower than American steel, causing the cutting equipment to fail. He requisitioned additional torch assemblies from the engineering depot and organized the welders into rotation shifts, one team cutting while another team's equipment cooled. Production increased to 22 devices on July 15th, still insufficient. WWII brought in 40 more welders from maintenance battalions across Normandy. By July 17th, production reached 38 devices per day. The math remained brutal. 3,000 tanks, 38 per day, 79 days total. Cobra launched in 8 days. The welding process revealed another problem. The four-prong assembly weighed 320 lb. When bolted ATOA Sherman's bow, the added weight shifted the center of gravity forward by 6 in. The front suspension compressed. After repeated hedro impacts, the suspension springs on several test vehicles showed stress fractures. If these springs failed in combat, the tank would be immobilized with a broken front end. Cullen modified the mounting system. Instead of bolting the prongs directly to the bow plate, he added reinforcement brackets that distributed weight across the hull's structural frame. The modification added 30 minutes to each installation, but prevented suspension damage. By July 19th, 6 days before Cobra, production reached 64 devices per day. The Ordnance Group had completed approximately 400 modifications. 2,600 tanks remained. Bradley's staff sent a priority message. The general wanted a minimum of 2,000 Rhino tanks for the offensive. If the Ordnance Group couldn't meet that number, Cobra might be delayed. Delaying Cobra meant the Germans could reinforce their Bocage defenses. Every day of delay cost lives. Doherty found more steel. Engineers had stockpiled additional Czech hedgehogs near Utah. Beach. Transportation units hauled the obstacles. Inland on July 20th. The Ordnance Group now had enough raw material for 5,000 devices. The bottleneck was welding capacity. Cullen contacted maintenance sections from units not scheduled for Cobra's first wave. Tank recovery teams had welding equipment for field repairs. He organized them into auxiliary production cells. 15 additional welding stations came online July 21st. Production jumped to 112 devices per day. The deadline pressure intensified. Welders worked through the night under floodlights powered by mobile generators. The production site looked like an industrial factory dropped into a Norman field. Sparks from cutting torches illuminated rows of tanks waiting for modification. The smell of hot metal and welding flux hung in the air. Nobody slept more than 4 hours. July 22nd, 3 days before Cobra. Production total reached 1,200 devices. Doherty calculated they could install another 850 before the offensive launched. Total 250 Rhino tanks, just above Bradley's minimum requirement. Then the steel ran out. The Hedgehog stockpiles were exhausted. The Ordnance Group had processed every German beach obstacle between the beachhead and Cherbourg. Engineers found approximately 300 more Hedgehogs scattered along minor beach exits. But transportation was tied up, moving ammunition and fuel for Cobra. The obstacles wouldn't arrive in team. Doherty considered alternatives. Railroad tracks could substitute for Hedgehog steel. The tracks were softer than German steel, but available in quantity. Several units had already experimented with railroad-based designs. Lieutenant Charles Green's battalion, the 747th, had welded massive railroad tie prongs to several tanks. They called it the Green Dozer. The railroad prongs were heavier and crudder than Cullen's design, but they worked. The Ordnance Group shifted to a hybrid production model. Cullen Hedgehog cutters for units with steel remaining. Railroad prongs for everyone else. July 23rd, 2 days before Cobra. The production count reached 1,800 devices. Another 500 were in progress using railroad steel. Final estimated total 2,300 Rhino tanks. 77% of Bradley's armor. Not 3,000, not perfect, but enough. The modified tanks moved to forward assembly areas on July 24th. Cullen walked through the staging zones near Marini, watching column after column of Shermans roll past. Every single tank carried 4 steel prongs on its bow. They looked absurd, like prehistoric animals equipped for battle. Operation Cobra would begin with a massive air bombardment at dawn, July 25th. 3,000 Allied aircraft dropping 4,000 tons of explosives on German positions. Then the armor would advance through the bocage, using Cullen's devices to breach hedge the Germans thought were impregnable. Cullen hadn't slept in 72 hours. His hands were covered in burns from hot metal. But he stood in that field watching the tanks assemble and understood something profound. Those steel prongs represented 14,000 men who might survive the Boca breakout. 14,000 soldiers who wouldn't burn to death, exposing their tank bellies to German guns. Whether the devices actually worked in combat would be determined in approximately 9 hours. July 25th, 6:11 a.m. The ground near St. Lo shook as 1,500 Allied bombers dropped 4,000 tons of explosives on German positions. Cullen watched from a forward observation post 3MI behind the start line. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes. When it stopped, the silence felt unnatural. At 7:45 a.m., the first Rhino tanks crossed into the bocage. 2nd Armored Division led the assault. 3rd Armored Division followed. 1st Infantry Division provided support. Every tank carried Cullen's 4-prong device, or the railroad-based variant. Radio reports started coming through at 8:15 a.m. Company B from the 2nd Armored reached their first hedgerow objective. The lead Sherman accelerated to 25 Venipeterums and struck the earthen wall. The prongs dug in. The tank pushed through in 16 seconds. The crew reported no damage to the device or suspension. More reports followed. Company C breached 3 hedger rows in 20 minutes. Company A pushed through 5 consecutive hedge lines without stopping. The pattern repeated across the entire assault front. Tanks that should have taken hours to advance one field were crossing multiple hedgerows in minutes. The Germans weren't prepared. Their defensive doctrine assumed American tanks would climb over hedgerows, exposing vulnerable belly armor. Panzerfaust teams positioned themselves for upward shots at exposed undersides. Anti-tank guns aimed at predictable climb points. When the Rhinos punched straight through at ground level, the German firing solutions became worthless. By 10:30 a.m., 2nd Armored Division had advanced 2 diaries that normally took 3 days. 3rd Armored Division reported similar progress. The Boca defensive network was collapsing because the terrain advantage had disappeared. Hedgerows that stopped tanks for 6 weeks were now just obstacles that delayed advance by 15 seconds. But the devices weren't perfect. Reports of failure started coming in around 11 a.m. A Sherman from the 741st Tank Battalion hit a hedgerow with a buried stone foundation. The prongs bent backward on impact. The tank couldn't move forward or reverse. The crew abandoned the vehicle under machine gun fire. 2 men died getting out. Another failure at 11:20 a.m. A light tank's prongs broke off completely when they struck an iron fence post hidden in the hedge base. The tank commander reported the device ripped away, taking part of the bow plate with it. The tank was combat effective but couldn't breach more hedgerows. A third failure at noon. A tank destroyer with railroad prongs hit a hedge at 30 miles/hour, too fast. The impact buckled the mounting brackets. The prongs twisted sideways and jammed the right track. The vehicle was immobilized. The failure rate was approximately 4%. 4 failed breaches out of every 100 attempts. Not catastrophic, but significant. 4% of 2,300 tanks meant 92 devices would fail during Cobra. 92 crews potentially trapped in open fields with German guns targeting them. Cullen monitored the radio traffic from the observation post. Most reports were positive. Tanks advancing faster than any point since D-Day. But those failure reports gnawed at him. 4%, 92 tanks, 460 men. At 1:30 p.m., a report came through that changed everything. A battalion from 3rd Armored Division had reached the Marin-St. Gilles Road that was 4 miles inland. 4 miles in 6 hours. The same distance had taken 2 weeks in June. By 3 p.m., advanced elements were 5 miles inland. German units were retreating because they couldn't establish new defensive lines fast enough. The bocage terrain that protected them had become useless. American armor was moving through it like open ground. Bradley's headquarters issued an assessment at 4:15 p.m. Operation Cobra was succeeding beyond projections. The Rhino tanks had solved the bocage problem. Estimated German casualties were 3 times higher than American losses. The defensive stalemate was broken. Cullen left the observation post at 5:00 p.m. He drove back toward the production site at Columbia. The welding stations were abandoned now. All the tanks had moved forward. The field was empty except for cut steel scraps and burnt-out torch tips. He sat on a Jeep hood and tried to process what happened. A sketch on a ration box 3 weeks ago. Beach obstacle steel welded to tank bows. And now the entire Normandy front was moving because tanks could punch through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. The failure rate bothered him. 4% meant the design wasn't perfect. Stone foundations, hidden fence posts, impact speeds, variables he hadn't tested. 92 crews paying the price for those gaps. But 2,200 devices worked. 14,000 men advancing through terrain that should have killed them. The math was brutal but clear. 4% failure was better than 60% casualties from exposed belly armor. As the sun set, he could hear artillery fire in the distance. The front had moved 8 mi inland, 8 mi in one day. The bocage was behind them now. July 26th, Bradley's headquarters issued production orders for additional hedge cutters. Units advancing beyond the bocage were encountering scattered hedge lines in interior France. The devices remained useful. The Ordnance Group received authorization to produce another 500 units using remaining railroad steel. By July 28th, the production count reached 2,850 modified tanks. That represented approximately 60% of First Army's armored vehicles. The remaining 40% were specialized vehicles that couldn't mount the devices or units held in reserve. The geographic spread was remarkable. 2nd Armored Division used Rhino tanks from St. Lau to Coutons. 3rd Armored Division employed them from Marin to Avache. 1st Infantry Division deployed them during the Morton counterattack. 4th Armored Division received devices on July 30th and used them advancing toward Brittany. Different units adapted the basic design. The 747th Tank Battalion preferred heavy railroad prongs. The 2nd Armored Division standardized on Coulan's lighter Hedgehog steel version. Some tank destroyer units welded shorter 3-prong variants to preserve gun traverse. Light tank crews used 2-prong versions to reduce weight. Maintenance units developed field repair procedures. Bent prongs could be straightened with hydraulic jacks. Broken welds could be rewelded in 30 minutes. Broken welds could be rewelded in 30 minutes. He was a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, connecting to his family's Revolutionary War heritage through Colonel Curtis Grubb. He lived quietly in New York City. No interviews, no speaking engagements, just a regular life. The tactical doctrine inspired by his innovation had lasting impact. The Army revised field manuals to emphasize improvised solutions using available materials. Training programs taught officers to encourage enlisted innovations rather than waiting for official equipment. The concept that a sergeant could solve a strategic problem became institutionalized. NATO forces adopted similar approaches. British, Canadian, and French armies developed their own field modification protocols. The Soviet Union, despite rejecting the hedgerow cutter itself, began allowing more tactical flexibility at lower command levels. The precedents set in Normandy influenced Cold War military doctrine. The actual devices mostly disappeared. A few Rhino tanks were preserved in museums. The Patent Museum at Fort Knox displayed a Sherman with original hedrogs. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans later acquired a similar example. But most of the 2850 devices were scrapped or lost. The engineering principles survived. Modern combat engineers study the cooling device as a case study in rapid field adaptation. The concept of using enemy obstacles as raw materials for friendly innovations appears in current military training. Army engineers in Iraq and Afghanistan applied similar thinking when developing counter-IED equipment. Curtis Coolin died on November 20th, 1963, in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. He was 48 years old. The obituary and local papers mentioned his Legion of Merit and his role in developing the Hydro cutter, but the notice was brief. Few people outside military history remembered the innovation or its significance. 1 year later, something unexpected happened. President Dwight Eisenhower gave a television interview to CBS correspondent Walter Cronkite on the 20th anniversary of D-Day. Cronkite asked about the Bocahage problem. Eisenhower told the story of the Hydro cutter. He described Cool by name. He explained how the device changed the campaign. The interview aired on June 6, 1964. Millions of Americans watched. Eisenhower's endorsement, delivered on national television by a former Supreme Allied commander, transformed the Hydro cutter from footnote to legend. Coolin wasn't alive to see it, but his contribution finally received the recognition it deserved. The interview footage was filmed in actual Normandy Hydro country. Eisenhower stood in a field near St. Lo, showing Cronkite where the original demonstration occurred. The Hydros were still there 20 years later, still 12 ft high, still formidable obstacles. And Eisenhower explained how one sergeant from New Jersey solved a problem that baffled an entire army. The official recognition began before Operation Cobra finished. On July 28, 1944, 1st Army Headquarters issued Technical Bulletin TBR 231. The bulletin officially designated the device as Hydro Cutting Device M1 Cullen type. It included installation specifications, tactical employment guidelines, and maintenance procedures. The designation meant the improvised modification had become standard Army equipment. Supply depots stocked replacement prongs. Maintenance units carried welding specifications. Training manuals incorporated breach techniques. A field invention created in 3 days had entered official military doctrine in 3 weeks. Third Army adopted the device when it became operational on August 1st. General George Patton's forces received approximately 500 cutters for their advance across France. Patton's after-action reports credited the devices with enabling rapid movement through scattered bocage terrain in Brittany and eastern France. 9th Army received technical specifications in September when it deployed to Europe. They manufactured approximately 200 devices using salvaged German steel from fortifications. The production happened at forward depots rather than Normandy beaches, proving the concept could be replicated anywhere steel and welding equipment existed. The British 21st Army Group formally requested American technical assistance on August 5th. British engineers visited the Columbia's production site and studied the design. They created their own variant, called the prong device, Mark I. Canadian forces developed similar equipment, designated obstacle cutter improvised type A. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force issued a combination for innovative field engineering on August 15th. The combination cited the Hydro cutter as an example of enlisted initiative solving operational problems. WWII distributed the citation to all Allied armies in Europe. It emphasized that tactical solutions could originate from any rank. The statistical analysis completed in September quantified the impact. 1st Army's Operational Research Section compared casualty rates before and after Rhino deployment. Tank losses dropped from 8.3% per engagement to 4.7%. Crew casualties decreased 37%. Time required to advance through boged terrain decreased by 73%. The economic calculation was equally significant. Each destroyed Sherman cost approximately $63,000 in 1944 currency. Each Hydro cutter cost approximately $40 in scrap steel and 12 man-hours of labor. The devices saved an estimated 300 tanks during Cobra. That represented $18.9 million in preserved equipment, not counting the value of trained crews. The Armored Force Board at Fort Knox reviewed the device in October 1944. Their report recommended incorporating Hydro breach training into basic tank crew qualification. The recommendation was implemented in November. Every American tank crew trained after that date learned Coulin's techniques. Field Manual FM 1733, the Armored Battalion, received an update in December 1944. The update included a full chapter on obstacle breaching using improvised cutting devices. Diagrams showed proper prong installation. Tactical sections explained breach procedures. Maintenance sections covered field repairs. The doctrine spread beyond armored forces. Combat engineer training incorporated the concept of using enemy obstacles as raw materials. Infantry officers learned to identify suitable breach points for supporting armor. Artillery forward observers studied how to coordinate fires during heat-drop breaching operations. The long-term effect extended into Cold War doctrine. NATO forces developing plans for potential combat in Central Europe studied the Bocage campaign extensively. Warsaw Pact defensive doctrine anticipated. NATO forces using similar improvised breaching equipment. Soviet military publications from the 1950s referenced the Cullen device as an example of capitalist military flexibility. The U.S. Army's Combat Studies Institute is the Hydro Cutter as a teaching case from 1953 onward. Officer candidates at West Point analyze the decision-making process that led to the devices. Adoption.enlisted leadership courses taught that tactical problems could be solved at any rank with proper initiative. By 1960, the Hydro Cutter appeared in 16 forwards. Different military training curricula across NATO armies. The total number of soldiers who studied the innovation exceeded 50,000. The concept that one sergeant's sketch could change a campaign became institutionalized military knowledge. But Curtis Cullen never taught those classes, never gave those lectures, never saw the doctrine manuals that bore his name. He worked at Schenley Industries, lived quietly in New York, and died in 1963. 18 months before Eisenhower's television interview made him a household name. The question became whether his contribution would be remembered beyond military circles or fade into the obscurity that claims most wartime innovations. The modern legacy of Curtis Cullen's invention exists in 3 places: museum exhibits, military doctrine, and the memories of veterans who survived because of 4 steel prongs welded to tank bows. The Patent Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky, exhibits an M4 Sherman equipped with original Cullen-style Hydro Cutters. The display plaque describes the Bocage obstacle and how a sergeant from New Jersey resolved it using steel from German beach defenses. Roughly 30,000 visitors view the exhibit each year. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans acquired a comparable Sherman in 2007. Their display features photographs of the production line at Columbia and reproductions of Bradley's initial orders for mass fabrication. Interactive installations allow visitors to grasp the engineering concepts behind the prongs. The Musée du Débarquement in Normandy dedicates a small section to American field innovations, showcasing genuine Hydro Cutter prongs salvaged from abandoned tanks near St. Lo. French visitors frequently fail to recognize their importance, but American veterans do. However, the most significant legacy isn't in museums. It's in doctrine. Every contemporary military force teaches the principle Cullen demonstrated. Strategic challenges can be addressed using available materials, tactical initiative, and a moment of courage. That lesson shaped equipment design, training procedures, and command philosophy for 8 decades. The Hydro Cutter principle resurfaced in Iraq when soldiers welded scrap metal onto Humvees as improvised armor. It reappeared in Afghanistan when engineers modified mine-resistant vehicles with field-fabricated components. It manifests whenever troops confront unexpected tactical dilemmas and engineer solutions without waiting for standard-issue equipment. Curtis Cullen's grave lies in New Jersey. The headstone notes his military service and his Legion of Merit, but does not reference the Hydro Cutter. Most people walking through that cemetery are unaware of who he was or what he accomplished. Yet 2,500 men returned from Normandy because of his invention. Those men had children. Those children had children. The number of lives today that exist because Curtis Cullen welded beach scrap to a tank in July 1944 is incalculable. Thousands, possibly tens of thousands. He never realized this. He passed away believing his contribution was minor. He worked a regular job, lived quietly, never sought accolades, never wrote memoirs, never gave interviews, just a sergeant from Cranford who saw a problem and solved it. The last surviving member of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron died in 2019. His obituary mentioned serving alongside Curtis Cullen. The veteran recalled witnessing the first Hedro breach and said it was the moment he knew they would survive Normandy. That is the true legacy. Not the medals, not the museum exhibits, not the doctrine manuals. The legacy is measured in lives. 1,500 men who didn't perish in Sherman tanks. 1,500 families who recovered their sons, husbands, and fathers. And it all began with a sergeant staring at scrap steel on a Norman beach, envisioning what those German obstacles could become if welded to American tanks. If this story resonated with you the way it did with us, do us a favor. Hit that like button. Every like signals YouTube to share this story with more viewers. Subscribe and activate notifications. We're uncovering forgotten stories from dusty archives every week. Tales of sergeants, mechanics, and ordinary soldiers who saved lives with scrap metal, courage, and 15 seconds of ingenuity. Real people, real heroism. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Texas, Germany, Australia, Japan? Our community spans the globe. You're not just a viewer. You're helping preserve these memories. Share your location. Share if a family member served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring Curtis Cullen's story doesn't fade into obscurity. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.